did like a fully professional really deity.
Behind us is the Vaikunta Perumal temple of Kanchipuram near Chennai. This temple is some 1,200 years old. It's very important for our study of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavata Purana, because this temple is like a three-dimensional Bhagavata Purana. It has 52 bas-relief images which are based on stories which we find in the Bhagavata Purana. This is a temple which is a treasure house of history. It has to do with a king, Nandivarman Pallavamala, who has established this temple of Vishnu and Krishna as a way of legitimizing his own rule in the Pallava dynasty. So we're here because we want to make this connection of our text, the Bhagavata Purana, with history. It is important also for establishing the age of the Bhagavata Purana, which is very much a matter of dispute among scholars. From this temple we can understand the temple is the text, the Bhagavata Purana, is at least 1,200 years old. Sahasracha Sahasravata Sabumim Vishvato Ritva Atyatishta Dashangulam. We're here at the Vaikunta Perumal temple in Kanchipuram, and I have two very good friends of mine with me who are taking part in the Bhagavata Purana conference. We have His Holiness Hanumat Preshika Gosvāmī, who has studied at University of California in Berkeley. He has studied psychology, and he has been studying the psychology of the Bhagavata Purana. We also have with us Professor Ravi M. Gupta, also a scholar of the Bhagavata Purana. He is professor of religion at the Utah State University in the United States. He's also taking part in this conference, so we'll be discussing with him. I've been working with Professor Gupta over several years on translations of the Bhagavata Purana, so we have a lot in common with regard to this text. So we'll be discussing this together.
I look forward to it.
So, Professor Gupta, can you tell us what is this book, the Bhagavata Purana?
So, the Bhagavata Purana is traditionally said to have 18,000 verses, a couple hundred chapters, and it's a series of stories, of narratives about Vishnu, Krishna, his avatars, through the ages. It's essentially a story about the passage of time. And the kings and leaders, the avatars that come to earth over time and in the heavens. And it's a series of nested dialogues, a series of questions and answers between sages and kings, mostly. It's a series of stories that has attracted the attention of generations of people in India and now the world as a result of some very profound characteristics that this poem has. So first of all, it's a work of poetry, and the poetry is extraordinary. Beautiful Sanskrit meters that have rhythm, alliteration, ornamentation. It's also a work of philosophy, and I think this is part of what makes the Bhagavata so attractive and unusual in the body of Sanskrit literature, is that it brings together, on the one hand, it's a piece of fine literature, beautiful poetry, and on the other hand, it's a work of philosophy. And typically you don't see these two things together. Philosophical works, from my own experience, tend to be pretty plodding, boring, and works of poetry and literature tend not to be systematic in their thought. And the Bhagavata is, it provides some very deep, even dense philosophical thought, and at the same time does it in a form of poetry that is enchanting, that's very beautiful. And I think it's that combination that has made it so attractive and so often read and loved.
You say that it's a story of time, and it's of a particular time, in a sense, the present time. Can you say something about that? It speaks of what it calls the Kali Yuga, the age of degradation. Can you elaborate?
So some of the best literature emerges in times of transition, of liminality, when people are unsettled because the times are changing. And in some ways the times are always changing, but in moments of great change, human beings give deep thought to their circumstances and question who they are and what they need to be doing. And the Bhagavata Purana is set in one of these cosmic transition periods. According to the Puranic time scale, the Bhagavata was spoken just at the beginning of this age of Kali. So the end of the third age, Dwapara, which was still a decent age, leading into the age of Kali, which is full of all kinds of problems and worries and troubles for human beings, and a declining moral quality as well. And it's during this time, or the impending time that is to come, that the sages ask the sage Sutta as to what the solution might be to the ills that are going to come to human beings. And in response to that, he says, well, actually, I've heard a dialogue between the sage Shuka and the king Parikshit, and it's this dialogue that I think holds the answer, the medicine for the troubles that we will face in this coming age of Kali, the dark age, which is just beginning and will last for several 100,000 years longer.
So we're presently in this age now.
We are, I'm sorry to say.
And the Bhagavata is affirming, so to say, conditions that we experience today?
Yeah, the Bhagavata describes in detail the types of things it says will happen in this age, shorter lifespans and conflict between human beings and unsettled relationships. And it says that in that darkness, a lack of knowledge really is the primary problem. In that darkness, this Bhagavata has emerged like the sun rises to give light to those who have lost vision in this dark age of Kali.
We usually hear that lifespan is extending in time, and you're saying the Bhagavata says it's getting shorter.
It is. Whatever the statistics might be in terms of increasing lifespan, from the Puranic cosmic time scale, the change from even 40 to 100 is a mere blip. We're talking about a decrease in time, in lifespans from 10,000 years to 1,000 years to 100 years and so on. So these time scales are not anything compared to what we normally discuss and think about. Millions of years and grand changes in human physique and psychology.
So does the Bhagavatam teach how we can become 10,000 years old?
Actually not. The Bhagavata starts off by saying that it is not interested in improving conditions in a physical sense, but really providing an opportunity to connect with something greater, and that's the lila, the play of Bhagavan, of Vishnu, of Krishna. And it's that opportunity to enter another world that provides the self-release from the darkness of this age that draws us down.
So not material well-being, but what can we say, spiritual well-being?
Spiritual well-being. And I would say material well-being is definitely part of the equation. The Bhagavata has not given up on the world, but really sees the solution as lying by transforming the world around us, by seeing it through the lens of Krishna's play.
So you use this word lila, a Sanskrit word which we often translate as pastime or sport. And that points to another technical term, bhakti. This word comes up many times. It came up in our translation work so many times. And we finally decided not to translate the word bhakti. But can you please try to translate and say something how it's important in the Bhagavata?
So bhakti comes from the root bhaj, which means to share. And it's essentially a sharing of a relationship between the Lord, between God and his devotees, or between two human beings. And it's when it's often translated as devotion or even love. So the danger with translating bhakti as merely devotion is that we might mistake it for a passive state of being in a state of devotion, when in fact bhakti is all about activity. It's about engagement, and bhakti throughout the centuries and in the Bhagavata particularly has been expressed through multiple ways, through service to the divine, through service to other human beings, through dance and music and drama, culture and literature. All of these become expressions of bhakti. So it's a combination of the idea of devotion as a state of feeling and service as an activity.
You mentioned literature or narrative and philosophy, how these are so nicely blended. Can you give an example of this?
Definitely. I think one of the finest examples of this, the Bhagavata makes its intention very clear right at the outset by, in the first 3 verses, juxtaposing so beautifully the philosophical dimension of the text along with the literary poetic dimension. If you recall the first verse of the Bhagavata, it's a verse in an extraordinarily long meter called Shardula Vikriditam, and it basically reads as it sounds like a string of metrically arranged sutras that are as dense in meaning and content as any of the Vedānta sutras, for example.
What is a sutra?
A short phrase that expresses truth very concisely, but is not understandable without commentary or explanation. And so the first verse, for that reason, has received endless commentary, people parsing out different phrases, trying to explain what it means.
Can we hear this verse from you?
Sure. It goes like this. Janmadyasya yatonvayaditarataschaर्थेष्वभिज्ञ स्वराट् Janmadyasya yatonvayaditarataschaर्थेष्वभिज्ञ स्वराट् Tene brahma hridaya adi kavaye muhyanti yat suraya Tejo vari mridam yatha vinimayo yatra trisargo mrisha Dhamna svena sada nirasta kuhakam satyam param dhimahi Dhamna svena sada nirasta kuhakam satyam param dhimahi.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
So you said this is a book of poetry. I can understand what you're saying.
Yes. Yes, and yet the ideas expressed there, the very first 3 words, Janmadyasya yataha, is straight from the Vedānta Sutra, this work of philosophy that begins with the idea that everything is born from, exists within, and ultimately dissolves into the supreme absolute reality, Brahman. And with that lofty idea, it becomes more and more philosophically rich as the verse proceeds, concluding with the rather famous phrase, Satyam Param Dhimahi. Let us meditate on the supreme truth, with the word Dhimahi recalling the Gayatri mantra, which is so very important in the Vedic tradition.
You mentioned sages and kings. This is a work of sages and kings. And you mentioned Sutta, the sage, and then Shuka. Sounds very similar. And then the king to whom he spoke, Parikshit. Can you just say briefly, what is that story about how they came together?
So King Parikshit is the heir to the throne of the Pandavas. And the Pandavas are 5 brothers who are heroes in the story of the Mahabharata, the great epic of India. And at the end of this story, nearly everyone is killed in the great Mahabharata war. The Pandavas retire, leaving their grandson, Parikshit, as the heir to the throne. And he starts off with a promising rule, a very good king, but one time heads to the forest on a hunting expedition, and finds himself exhausted, tired, enters the hut, the ashram of a sage, and when he arrives there is looking for water and a place to sit. But the sage is in deep meditation, and so the king's requests for water go unheeded. In a moment of frustration, anger, and real thirst, he picks up a dead snake that's lying outside the sage's home and throws it around the sage's neck and leaves in frustration. It so happens that the sage's son, named Shringi, comes home to see this dead snake around his father's neck, recognizes it as an insult, and becomes angry enough to utter a curse against whoever threw that snake upon his head, around his neck. And that curse is that whoever did that must die within 7 days. It's a terrible curse. The father is deeply dismayed, horrified really, to see that his son made such a terrible curse, but there's nothing much that can be done about it. When Parikshit hears about this, instead of becoming angry or upset or looking for retaliation, takes it as the will of the Lord and really a blessing to refocus his life on what is actually important. So he gives up his kingdom, makes his son the next king, and heads to the banks of the Ganga, the Ganges, where he decides to fast to death, and for 7 days. And being the pious and righteous king that he is, sages from all over the world are said to descend to that location. And they all want to witness this person's passing and be with him for his last breaths. Nevertheless, there is one person who shows up, that person causes all the other sages to rise and to offer their respects. It's not the oldest among them. He's just a young man, maybe 16, 17 years old, wearing not a stitch of clothing. He's totally given up the world, knows no difference between man or woman. And when he arrives, his name is Shukadeva, and he takes a seat in the assembly. Everyone instantly recognizes him as the most honored amongst them. And King Parikshit begins to ask him a question. And the question is, can you tell me what is the duty of a man who is about to die? Mm-hmm. That question, although very relevant to Parikshit's circumstance, in a way is relevant to every person's circumstance. And that's what makes the Bhagavata so compelling. Because after all, we are all about to die. It may not be in 7 days, it could be in 7 years or 70 years, but nevertheless, death is as certain as life is. And so the Bhagavata makes itself immediately relevant to all its listeners who might have the wisdom to recognize their own mortality.
Would people of today, it seems that people of today who study the Bhagavata take it seriously, but it's surprising considering the fact that Shuka is portrayed as one who is utterly and totally renounced, considering that our modern age doesn't seem to be an age of renunciation. So how does this work? Why is it that the Bhagavata has persisted in its popularity?
I think there could be many answers to it. I personally think that the Bhagavata's relevance comes from its very honest view of human nature. The Bhagavata recognizes human desire, human weakness as well. Some of the most compelling stories in the Bhagavata are ones where human beings seek the ultimate and yet stumble and then come back to have their success. What I like to call second chance narratives. They happen again and again. One of the most famous is the story of Ajamila, who begins life in a wonderfully pious way and then ends up stumbling with a moral lapse, and then comes back to become very focused and ultimately achieve the highest end. But there are many like this, the story of Jad Bharata, for example. And again and again, the Bhagavata makes its message relevant to us mere mortals, to ordinary human beings who struggle with life's day-to-day challenges, rather than simply providing a lofty message for the likes of renunciates and sages, who frankly most of us aren't.
Right. One of our day-to-day challenges as we were translating the Bhagavata together, which was such an enjoyable, hardly work really for us, but it was a challenge, was has been translating the Sanskrit into English. If you had to choose one of the passages that you most enjoyed translating, what would that be?
That's a good question. I enjoyed so much of the Bhagavata. Each part of it presents different kinds of poetry, different emotions, different psychological situations. So it's very difficult to choose one. But if I had to, I would choose the story of Jaya and Vijaya's fall from Vaikunta. Here we are in the background, Vaikunta Perumal temple. One of Vishnu's names is Vaikunta, but also his abode is known as Vaikunta, a place with no worry, no problems, and a place no one would really want to leave. And yet Jaya and Vijaya are cursed and forced to fall from Vaikunta. That story of their descent, I enjoyed very much translating, not only because of the beautiful language in the Bhagavata, but because of the very rich commentarial tradition that's found in those passages. Essentially, the commentators, they debate the question as to who is to blame for these two very wonderful attendants to Vishnu. Who is to blame for their fall from heaven? And some say it's them and their wrongdoings. Others say it's the four sages who cursed them. And yet others say the ultimate blame lies with the Lord himself for orchestrating the whole situation.
As Leela.
As Leela, exactly, as play, as sport. And so I truly enjoyed that passage. The other thing that was nice about that passage was the description of Vaikunta itself. The lush and rich description, both in terms of the constructed elements, the palaces and the gems and the gold and everything is beautifully gilded, but also the natural scenery, the plants and the trees. From what I could tell, much of the vegetation was watery vegetation that grows where plenty of water, rainfall exists. And so one can get a sort of vision of what heaven might look like.
Perhaps someplace like where we are right now, but not in this age of Kali.
Yeah. The Bhagavata is known in Sanskrit circles as the test of a person's Sanskrit knowledge. It's very difficult Sanskrit to translate.
That's why I had so much trouble with it.
I did too. The struggle was well worth it, but I think that difficulty lies in several areas. One is that it uses Vedic language that is not normal for Puranas, which are in a much later period of Sanskrit development. Also, its vocabulary is very difficult. I would have the experience of looking up a word in a particular verse in the dictionary, and the dictionary offers some kind of a definition and then cites the verse I'm working on as the only example of that word.
So it turns you in a circle.
Exactly. It's rather circular, and the only way to know the meaning is to go through the commentaries, really, which is likely where the dictionary got its meaning too, from received tradition. It's also, the text is unique because it's undergone relatively little change over the centuries. It's been a very stable text, which is cannot be said about most Puranas that tend to fluctuate a lot as they're retold and rewritten. And so the Bhagavata has a very stable manuscript tradition, which makes it very wonderful to read and to work on.
The Bhagavata is also teaching, and it's teaching a practice, a process for elevation, for, let's say, realizing the vision which it's giving. the question naturally comes again with regard to current application of the text and why it's popular. Is it even possible in this degraded age of Kali to practice what the Bhagavata is saying to be practiced? And I guess we need to know what is the essence of that practice.
So, I mean, the essence of that practice is definitely the cultivation of bhakti, this devotion and this service, engaged devotion to Bhagavan, to Vishnu or to Krishna, as it's shared and practiced within a community of devotees. One of the things that makes any text like the Bhagavata so vibrant and long-lasting is the fact that it can be applied in different historical situations through the generations. And that application cannot be thought of in a static way, where the Bhagavata is applied or ought to be applied exactly in the way it was done 1,000 years ago. Something like that would make the Bhagavata a museum piece, and museum pieces don't live well. They can be preserved and interpreted, but for something to be a living text, it really does need to be applied in our contemporary circumstance. And so, can the Bhagavata be applied? Well, definitely it can, and we see that it has been applied. It is today applied in multiple contexts, but every time it is applied, it is re-understood, reinterpreted, reinvigorated for our own times and for our own unique contexts. And the fact that that can happen, I think, is what makes the Bhagavata a piece of world classical literature.